أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين. وبعد. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he was the source of guidance and advice for the Sahaba during his lifetime and for those who follow the Sahaba after. And we as followers of the Sahaba want to follow in their way by referring back to the spring of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام for direction in our lives. And if we were to look to the types of questions that the Prophet ﷺ was asked by the Sahaba, it will give us indication about the types of questions we should ask about our lives today. The Sahaba would often question their own practices, their norms, their cultures, those which they had adopted prior to Islam. As the Sahaba, they were a collective that embraced Islam during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, and the sons of daughters of those who were embraced Islam and were born into Islam, they were blessed to be raised by a generation who followed the framework as their main source of culture. And so for us, living in the West, living in a globalized world wherein Western culture has become the dominant culture, we have to question elements of the culture that we adopt. And we have to question elements of everyday practices that we may engage in. One of those practices is the practice of the tongue. The practice of the tongue, the norms of the tongue, the way in which we use our tongues. As often we try to avoid the haram, the tangible haram, that which can be seen. And we try to only consume from that which is halal. But we don't take into consideration the role of the tongue within the framework of Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ advised one of the Sahaba, when one of the Sahaba asked him for guidance. And the Prophet ﷺ, in brief, he said, "Shall I tell you that which destroys a person's istiqamah, ability to stay upright?" And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Your tongue. Kuff alayka hadha." He said, hold your tongue accountable. And the Sahabi was surprised. He said, "Will a person be thrown into the hellfire or taken into account for that which they say?" And the Prophet ﷺ, he said to him, may your mother be bereaved of you." A statement of shock and a statement to tell this Sahabi, at the time young, pay attention. This affair is important, i.e. the affair of the tongue. He said, وَهَلْ يَكُبَّ النَّاسَ عَلَى وُجُوهِهِمْ إِلَّا فِي النَّارِ إِلَّا لِحَصَائِدِ أَلْسِنَتِهِمْ أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. He said, and will the people be thrown into the hellfire upon their faces for anything other than that which they say with their tongues? And if we were to reflect over that which we use our tongues for, perhaps we would be terrified. We would be terrified. Some of the things that we have to avoid with our tongue. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا. Do not engage in ghiba. Do not speak about each other with ghiba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَن يَأْكُلَ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا. Would one of you like to eat the dead flesh of his brother? Of course, no person. None of us here would sit and eat the dead flesh of his brother, but that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comparing backbiting to. Speaking about one another is like eating each other's flesh. And the Prophet ﷺ, he clarified, because a person may ask, what is ghiba? What is ghiba? Backbiting. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَتَدْرُونَ مَا الْغِيبَةِ. Do you know what ghiba is? To the Sahaba. And the Sahaba, of course, in the usual way, they replied, Allahu wa Rasuluhu a'lam. The Sahaba, they put their opinions aside and they wanted to hear from the spring of guidance that was the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, ذِكْرُ أَخَاكَ بِمَا يَكْرَهُ. He said, ﷺ, ghiba is to mention about your brother that which he does not want to be mentioned, that which he dislikes. And the Prophet ﷺ replied to some of the Sahaba as they asked, what if what we're saying about him is true? He said, إِن كَانَ فِيهِ مَا تَقُولُ فَقَدْ اخْتَبْتَهُ وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ فِيهِ مَا تَقُولُ فَقَدْ بَهَتَّهُ. He said, alayhi salam, if what you say about him is true, but he doesn't want you to say it, you've engaged in ghiba. And if you say about him that which is not true, then you've engaged in slander. And so either way, don't speak about your brother. Be very cautious and careful about speaking about others. And some today, some may say, oh, what about those who are clear in their mistakes? It's something you often hear. You can speak about the person of misguidance, the person of innovation, and so on and so forth. The person who commits openly, you can speak about them. The earlier generations of Islam, they used to say, we do not speak about those, even if they are engaged in innovations and misguidance and open, clear sin. We don't speak about them. Why? Because we do not want our tongues to become used to speaking about others. Once the tongue becomes accustomed to something, it's quite difficult to readjust. And you find this with those who have become accustomed to swearing in Allah's name for everything and anything. For the most minute to the most grand. Wallahi, billahi, tallahi, etc. And when a person becomes accustomed to this, you would hear them using Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name in conversations even about haram. Even about haram. Why? Because it's become a thing that they cannot regulate anymore. The tongue has to be held accountable. Some of the earlier scholars of Islam, the awliya, they said that the tongue is the foreign minister of the heart. Al-lisanu wazirul qalb. The tongue is the foreign minister of the heart. Whatever is contained in the heart will emerge on the tongue. Likewise, the tongue can also be used to regulate the heart. Why? Because when a person becomes conscious of what they're saying, it gives them indication to the state of their heart, and they can begin to fight and struggle against themselves before they speak, which leads to the regulation of the heart. There are two particular areas of our faces which are attached directly to the heart. Directly to the heart. One is for consumption, and one is for import, and the other is for export. We import into our heart to that which we look at, and we export from our heart to that which we say. And so we have to be very cautious with our eyes and with our tongues. That which I look at has a direct link to the heart. And likewise, that which I say often comes directly from the heart. The heart of the believer is behind his or in front of his tongue. The heart of the believer is in front of his tongue. He reflects with his heart before he speaks. And the heart of the hypocrite is behind his tongue. He speaks first, and if he reflects later. And usually the reflection of the hypocrite is not based upon what is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's based upon what can afford me the most gain in this dunya. Did I say something that's going to cause me a problem later? Not did I say something that Allah is going to be displeased with. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir, falyaqul khayran aw layasmut." He said, ﷺ, the one who believes in Allah and the last day, let him say that which is good or remain quiet. Remain quiet. And in fact, you could even use a harsher word than remain quiet. Let him say that which is good or keep his mouth shut. That's how seriously we should take this matter. Before I speak, what I'm going to say, is it pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If not, is it displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If not, is it going to benefit me in any way in relation to my dunya? If not, why am I saying it? And the matter of the tongue was taken so seriously by the earlier generations of Islam that they would hold themselves accountable between Jum'ah and Jum'ah for the words that they used to say. Some of the ulama and the awliya of the past, they were able to count the words that they uttered from one Jum'ah to another. Why? Because they were terrified of the consequences of their tongue on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Ibn Abbas, radiallahu ta'ala, if I'm not mistaken, he said, I am afraid that I have said one word which has destroyed all of my good deeds. If that's Ibn Abbas, what about us? And the Prophet ﷺ, various ahadith relating to the tongue that I'm not going to mention in detail here, but one in particular comes to mind. The one who uses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name for the sake of a sale, the sale will be cursed. There will be no barakah in his sale. If we go to the marketplace, how many wallahis are we going to hear? When two Muslims are interacting with each other for the sake of financial gain, how many wallahis are going to be used? The tongue is something that needs to be restrained and restricted. For that reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us two guards, a set of teeth and a set of lips. The tongue needs to be kept behind bars. One word and a person is married. One word and a person is divorced. One word and a person can put themselves into a position which is the equivalent to war. Wars are started with a word. And wars are likewise ended with a word. Contracts become compulsory with a word. And likewise they can become nullified with a word. As was said previously, a word can make or break. A word can build or destroy. And we haven't even seen the impact of our words in the next life. We have to think before we speak and reflect deeply about that which we say. And especially in our homes, the way a man speaks to his wife, the way a woman speaks to her husband, the way parents speak to their children. Look up the psychological impact of parents speaking to their children in negative ways. When a parent puts the child down constantly, the child grows up to believe that they are the words that their parents used to utter about them. And we have, unfortunately, individuals who will say to their child, "You're stupid, you can't do anything, you're a fool, you always make mistakes," etc., etc., etc. Harsh. This affects the child. The child grows up with a deficit emotionally, mentally. It affects them spiritually. Likewise, the teacher putting down the student. The Prophet ﷺ, he was positive with his words. The Prophet ﷺ did not abuse physically, nor mentally, emotionally. And words sometimes can cut deeper than a knife, can hit harder than a slap. And so we have to reflect about the way we use our words. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, when he was asked about the best of Muslims, he said, "Man salima al-muslimuna min lisanihi wa yadihi." The best of Muslims are those whom other Muslims are safe from in regards to his tongue and his hand. His tongue and his hand. Those are the best of Muslims. And yet today, unfortunately, we will have Muslims who are practicing from their appearances, but yet they talk about other Muslims easily. They backbite, they slander, they make accusations. They say about their brothers that which they wouldn't say to their faces, number one. And number two, that which they wouldn't like to be said about themselves. Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, he gives the example of an individual that he found to be prevalent in his time. He said, you will find those who pray the nights and fast the days, and they are apparently those who study and have learned something of Islam, but their tongues are long and sharp. They speak about this person, they speak about that person, and so in doing so, what are they doing? All they're doing is giving up their good deeds to those that they speak about. When a person speaks about another, he is giving that person their good deeds. Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he says about the one who backbites constantly, this person needs to engage in a lot of ibadah. Why? Because on Yawm al-Qiyamah, he's going to have a line of people that want to come to take his good deeds. And when his good deeds run out, what's going to happen? He's going to be receiving their bad deeds. So this person, in reality, becomes a means of other people going to Jannah whilst he's taking himself to Jahannam. Why? Because he couldn't control his tongue. In Arabic, ghiba is called thamaratul majalis, the fruit of gatherings. Why? Because it's delicious, it's sweet, it's entertaining, it's exciting. People like to talk about other people. People like to hear other people's problems. People like to make themselves feel better by speaking ill and putting other people down. In this life, it might feel good, but in the next life, there are consequences. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us control of our tongues. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, من يضمن لي ما بين لحييه وما بين رجليه أضمن له الجنة. He said, عليه الصلاة والسلام, whoever can promise me, guarantee me that which is between his jawbones and that which is between his legs, i.e. his tongue and his private part, I guarantee for him a place in Jannah. What does he mean by this, alayhi salatu? He means the one who can regulate and control his desires, his lower desire, and his tongue, this person will have a place in Jannah. Every time I feel like speaking about someone and I bite my tongue, not literally of course, and I bite my tongue, then bi'idhnillah I am going to receive reward. Every time I have the feeling of lust or passion or compassion, desire for the opposite gender, etc., and I control myself and I regulate myself and I remind myself it's haram, I am going to earn myself bi'idhnillah a place in Jannah. The Prophet ﷺ is equating the danger of the tongue to the danger of the private part. And we all know fornication is haram. But how many of us consider backbiting and the misuse of the tongue as equivalent to fornication? Not many. How many of us can count the amount of words we said today? Not many. How many consider that which they say before they say it? Not many. But the Prophet ﷺ is telling us this matter is one of critical importance. Critical importance. The Prophet ﷺ, as has been mentioned on this minbar many times, why? Because this hadith is so significant, was informed about a lady who would pray the nights, pray the nawafil, give sadaqah. And the Prophet ﷺ said she is a person of hellfire. And the Prophet ﷺ was informed about a lady who would give dried milk as sadaqah, something insignificant. And she would only pray that which was obligatory, only fast Ramadan. And the Prophet ﷺ said she's a person of Jannah. Why? Because the former, the one who would pray the nights and fast the days, used to harm her neighbors. And from the ways that we can harm our neighbors with our tongue. And the other, she didn't. The tongue is of critical importance. And containing the tongue is of even more critical importance. How many marriages would still be intact if the man knew how to speak to his wife and the woman knew how to speak to her husband? Many marriages break down because of a lack of communication skills. And it's not a lack of communication skills, to be blunt. It's a lack of ability to communicate. It's not a skill to be polite. It's not a skill to be polite. It's common sense. It's common sense. When I'm speaking to the father of my children, the wife, the mother of my children, speak politely. When I'm speaking to a believing person, someone who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, speak politely. When I'm speaking to a non-Muslim, as a diplomat of Islam, speak politely. It's not a skill. To communicate properly is not a skill. It's something that can be developed, but it's common sense. It's common sense. When I'm speaking to someone, speak in a way which is respectful and politeful. If this was adhered to, marriages, many marriages would be intact. Likewise, relationships between parents and children would be intact. Relationships between siblings would be intact. Many individuals, they say the right thing, but in the wrong way or in the wrong time, and the results are problematic. Had they said the same thing, i.e. the right thing, in the right way or at the right time, the results would have been far different. Far different. The Prophet ﷺ, if we study the way he would speak, the Prophet ﷺ was the best of examples. When the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, enemies of Allah, he afforded them more dignity and respect than we sometimes afford Muslims. Don't take my word for it. Read the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to some of the heads of Quraysh, who wanted nothing more than to kill him, ﷺ, he granted them dignity and respect more so than we grant to each other sometimes as Muslims. And the reason I say this is because it's becoming a problem in marriages, communication. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ الْعَبْدَ لَا يَتَكَلَّمُ بِالْكَلِمَةِ مِنْ رِضْوَانِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى مَا يُلْقِي لَهَا بَالًا يَرْفَعُهُ اللَّهُ بِهَا دَرَجَاتٍ. That a person will say something pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this thing that they say will not be given any importance by this person. Perhaps it's dhikr, perhaps it's shukr, many things. He'll say something good in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use that word that he says to raise him levels in Jannah. and this person sees it as insignificant. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, وَإِنَّ الْعَبْدَ لَيَتَكَلَّمُ بِالْكَلِمَةِ مِنْ سَخَطِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى لَا يُلْقِي لَهَا بَالًا يَهْوِي بِهَا في جهنم أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. He said that a person likewise will say something which is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something which angers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this person will give it no bearing. They'll think it's insignificant. Perhaps it's backbiting, perhaps it's slandering, perhaps it's saying something even about the qadr of Allah or about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wal-'iyadhu billah. And this person will think nothing of it, insignificant, it's just a word. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with that word, with that sentence, will send this person levels below into Jahannam. The Prophet ﷺ famously said to Aisha radiallahu anha, when she described one of his other wives as being short, simply describing her as being short, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَقَدْ قُلْتِ كَلِمَةً, you have said a word. Look at the way the Prophet ﷺ distinguishes between the word said and Aisha radiallahu anha. The Prophet ﷺ didn't speak about Aisha directly. The Prophet ﷺ made the conversation about the word. He said, you have said a word. If this word were to be placed into the oceans would be destroyed. They would become bitter because of this one word. That's the way we speak, number one, and look at how powerful a word can be. A good word takes a person to Jannah. A bad word takes a person to Jahannam. And from our culture in the West is to talk a lot. We talk a lot. And we consider the one who doesn't talk as having a problem. We even have words for such people, frigid and so on and so forth. But from our perspective, from the Islamic perspective, talking should not be done a lot unless there is benefit to talking. Talking a lot with the wife, that's beneficial. Talking a lot with the husband, beneficial. With the children, beneficial, as long as a framework is adhered to. Talking a lot to make someone feel happy, to bring contentment to their life, no problem, beneficial, as long as a framework is adhered to. But when we go out of that framework, we are simply putting ourselves at risk and putting ourselves in danger. One of the scholars of the past, one of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, the door to ghiba is to ask, how is so and so? That's the door to ghiba. If you want to close the door, don't ask about other people. Why? Because even if you can control your tongue, many people can't control theirs. You ask, how is so and so, and they'll mention things about that person that person does not want to be mentioned. Unless you are a strong person who can say to others, don't backbite, and you don't mind people being offended by you, don't ask about how others are. Ask them yourself. Pick up the phone and call them. Send them an email or a text message. Don't make your time, your pastime, the time where you give others your good deeds and take others' sins. Because that's the reality of what we're doing when we talk about others. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aid us and protect us from our tongues. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aid us and protect us from the tongues of others. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا واغفر لنا ولا تحرمنا من خير ما عندك بشر ما عندنا يا رب العالمين اللهم استخدمنا ولا تستبدلنا إنك مجيب الدعوات وأقم الصلاة.